I built a home theater. Right now, I consider it at a minimally viable product. It's a software term. It works. I can actually watch movies in it. They look pretty darn good. They sound pretty darn good. But the theater's not done. It has a lot of finishing details that are still needed. Probably another year's worth of work on the speed that I'm doing it. I decided to start making some Granworks videos, though, of constructing the remainder of this. This is the very first of those videos. In this video, I'm going to be building these columns. They serve three purposes in my theater. The first, and possibly most important, is this is where the surround sound speakers are going to go. Right about in here. This is acoustically transparent fabric right here. There's no speakers in there as yet, but that's where they will go when it's done. The second reason is for them to actually be able to store stuff. Maybe like LED controllers, or maybe theater equipment, or I mean not like the AV equipment, but other type of stuff. So I actually have a door on all of these. And then finally, they're aesthetic. Theaters feel like they should have columns. It's a pretty common thing to put inside of a theater. In my case, I went a little bit overboard, I think. Most columns that you see in theaters tend to be pretty simple, with maybe one color, two colors at most. I kind of went overkill a little here with the very red sides, kind of white trim, black inserts, and that's a mirror. Yeah, that's a no-no in most theaters. I just wanted a unique aesthetic touch that I haven't really seen in other theaters. I don't know if I'd do it again, but I did do it this time. So, let's see how it went. The columns are built almost entirely out of 3/4 inch MDF. A full sheet of 3/4 inch MDF weighs about 85 pounds. That's no fun on a table saw. First step when dealing with MDF then is to cut it to more manageable sizes using a circular saw. The table saw is for getting the very precise sizes that I need. Like for instance, the 2 inches I need for the face frames, and then the 8 1/4 inches that I need for the sides of the columns. I want them all to be exactly the same. I did build one prototype column already, so in this batch I've been building 3 at once. That means that everything is in multiples of 3. So we have 3 doors, we have 6 sides, we have 12 pieces for the face frames, and so on. Cross-cutting is a little bit trickier since I don't have any stop blocks that are long enough to be able to get reproducible cuts. In this case, I just tried to stack as many things as possible together to make sure that they're the same size, even if they're not all precise sizes. The top of the column angles back at 30 degrees, which means that a number of the pieces of the face frame also need to angle at 30 degrees. I tried to cut all of those at exactly the same time. Oof, that looks unsafe. I really should have had an insert in that case. Not sure what I was thinking. The 2 wide pieces that need to be cut at 30 degrees are the top of the face frame, which is 1.5 inches high, and then the top plate, if you call it that, which is about 5 inches high. The top and bottom face frame pieces can all be cut to the exact same width using a fence as a stop block of sorts. Assembling face frames with pocket screws and glue is actually a pretty common way to do face frames. In fact, I've done it a number of times myself before. I was hoping it was going to speed up the assembly time of these face frames so I wouldn't have to leave them in the clamps for quite as long. I don't think I've ever done this with MDF before though, as I soon found out. Oops, yep, it looks like the screws pretty much split the MDF. I think in the past I've always just used hardwood when I've done pocket screws. Well, lesson learned. From now on, if I'm going to be making MDF face frames, which admittedly is pretty rare, I'm just going to use just pure glue, no screws at all, or at least not pocket screws. I mean, I suppose if I went and fully pre-drilled pilot holes for that, it should be fine. But no, this time around it's going to be just glue and clamps. That's it. Then I went and cut the top cap to width. It needs to be 60 degrees on one angle and 30 degrees on the other, and exactly the 15 inches wide. Well, every project has some screw ups. In my case, minimum of one, probably a bunch of them. Looks like I started a little bit early this time. So I made these face frames to try and smooth these out as close as possible so I don't have to fix the face frame later very much. But this is a piece that attaches to it and it goes on an angle. Oops, that's not an angle. That's because this isn't the front. This is the front. Now, yeah, that's the angle that we wanted right there. But that's the front. What about these? Well, I could either redo it completely, or I could try just filling it with wood putty, sand it away, and see if that works. I'm gonna try the wood putty first. We'll see how that goes. Then came the angle at the top of the columns, which is either 30 degrees or 60 degrees, depending which way you look at it. I first tried the miter saw, but that didn't work very well since I had to put the column the lengthways on that. Next I went and used the table saw with the miter gauge at an angle. That worked a little bit better, but it was hard to get that to be too precise. So I cut all of them but one to be a little bit wide, and then used the one that was known to be good as a pattern to use the router and a flush cutting bit to trim the rest to the exact size. That worked reasonably well, although in the future I probably would use a circular saw or a jigsaw to do the rough cutting before using the router to get the final dimensions. And so begins the painting. Of the about 2 hours of video that I took for this build, maybe 45 minutes of it is just made up of me painting over and over. That's because I decided as much as possible that I wanted to paint the individual pieces before they were assembled rather than painting it all when it was done. I also primed everything in advance using some Zinsser Bin shellac-based primer. That stuff is pretty amazing, and I probably will do a separate video just on that particular topic in the future. It did make the cleanup and the management of the painting a little bit trickier though. That's because I had 4 paints that I needed to deal with. There was first of all the Zinsser Bin, which is shellac based and thus needs to be cleaned with either denatured alcohol or with ammonia. Then there was the black and the white, which are both latex and thus are pretty easy to clean using just water. And finally there is the red, which is a gel stain and is thus oil based, and that required using mineral spirits or paint thinner or something similar to that to actually do all the cleaning. That is a major pain. Can't seem to get the same depth of color though with any kind of latex based paint. With oil based, it's really a case of hate the process, love the results. Next up is routing out the dados for the shelves. The shelves act as both, well, shelves, but also as a way of kind of strengthening the whole column setup. I did a separate video on how to actually create and use this particular jig for cutting the exact size dados. I'll put a link to that in the description. The shelves were cut in such a way that taking their width plus then the thickness of the dados would result in a column that was exactly the width of the face frames that I had cut earlier. The shelves are just glued in place and then clamped until they're allowed to dry. No brads, no nails, no screws or anything like that. I did ensure that everything was square at this point because doing so later would be pretty much too late, and it'd be hard to actually get it to be square if it wasn't so at this point. Next up is attaching the angled top cap. Since it is angled, it does make it a little bit tricky to glue and then clamp. So therefore what I did was I glued it and then I went and attached it using some brad nails. Later I go and attach the face frame using the same concept of glue and brad nails, although I did clamp it in the first place. But you can see from even this early on stage that I am using the brad nailer inconsistently and in some cases very wrong. The individual brad nails have a little bit of a wedge on them, and so they will tend to blow out perpendicular to the nail gun. Practically speaking, this means that if you are nailing along an edge, you should never nail parallel to the thin part of the edge. What'll happen is if it blows out, it'll actually blow out probably on your finish side in that case, and you definitely don't want that. As you can see here, I wasn't really thinking and did a lot of parallel nailing. And yeah, wouldn't you know it, I ended up having a case of some pretty nasty blowout right along the red sides. That required a lot of fix-up work later. And none of that fix-up would have been necessary if I had just held the nail gun perpendicular from the start. Next up is the mirror for the door. They are each 11 by 20, so I started with plate glass that is 16 by 20, and then I marked off a point at 11 1/8 of an inch. That accounts for the thickness of the glass cutter. I have a video on cutting glass as well, which I'll link in the description. Essentially, you just score it with a glass scorer and then snap it, and then there you go. The back of the door is painted flat black just in case there's any kind of gap between the mirror and the frame that goes around the mirror. The mirror is actually created by painting the back of the glass black. It kind of has a really cool, what I call black mirror effect. I figured while I had the latex flat black paint out, I might as well try and paint the glass with that and just see what happens. In a word, it was a disaster. It did have some mirror qualities, but other than that, I mean, it was streaky and also just flaked all over the place. It's just a terrible, terrible mirror. The mirror is about 1/8 of an inch thick, and I wanted it to be recessed into the door. My first attempt was to route that out using a custom base plate and kind of template, but that just took way too much work. In the end, I went with a 1/2 inch base for the door, and then I put around it a 1/4 inch hardboard frame, which raised it up to 3/4 inch thickness. The frame was glued into place, and then I went and stapled it using some 1/8 inch or 5/8 inch staples. Originally the door was going to be 24 inches high, so therefore I would have the 20 inch mirror and then on the top and the bottom 2-inch pieces, which would pick up the 24. That proved problematic, so at the last second I went and changed the design, lose a 1/2 inch. That left the bottom piece being 1.5 inches rather than 2 inches. It also meant that I'd have to kind of custom fit them, which is why the glass is in there as I'm doing this. Part of the reason for making these doors was because I wanted to try and install Euro hinges for the first time. Installation is pretty precise, so I used a custom-made template. I then drilled out the hole using a 35mm Forstner bit on my drill press. Fits perfectly. The template actually had places for where to drill the pilot holes, but I found it easier to use the actual hinges and then to just drill out the pilot holes using a self-centering drill bit made for hinge screws. The hinges came with a paper template, but that's not very robust when doing multiple ones, so I made my own out of MDF. These allowed me to make very precise pilot holes over and over. I redid the mirrors, this time using Rust-Oleum acrylic spray. Much better. The fabric frame is made up of some scrap prime poplar that I had hanging around. It's sized to be a snug fit inside of the column's face frame so that I didn't need to attach it via any other method other than friction. I sprayed them with the same black that I used on the mirrors because it's really quick and why not? The mirrors are attached to the door with hot glue, which essentially gives me the possible opportunity to replace them in the future if they got broken or something like that. If I use construction adhesive, there's no way that mirror would ever come off. I'm using Scott's landscape fabric here as the acoustically transparent fabric because, well, I have it on hand and it does work. I'll eventually replace it with something a little bit better, maybe something that's actually fire rated instead of something that melts when it gets hot. I'm likely going to redo the entire fabric frames, not just the fabric, but the frames themselves when that time comes. The process is going to be the same though, which is effectively just folding over the fabric onto the frame and securing it with some upholstery staples using an upholstery gun. I didn't do the greatest job here, but hey, it's just temporary face frames anyway. And
And now on to installation. I attached 2 plywood cleats to the back of each of the columns using pocket screws. The cleats are then screwed directly to the studs using some pretty hefty 3-inch long screws. I found the stud using a magnet and my laser level. The column is hung only on the wall and doesn't touch the riser at all. I sized the fabric frames such that they would fit inside of the face frame pretty tightly using just friction. I don't need really any kind of magnets or anything like that, although I might for the final version. One of the 4 columns has vertical conduit hidden behind it, and that required cutting out some holes. I probably should have done this in advance because that would have been a lot easier when I didn't actually have it in the theater and then also put together where the tool access was pretty hard to do. I'm cutting these holes, for instance, because I totally forgot I had to do the bottom shelf until after I'd already moved the column back to its final position. It ain't pretty, but hey, nobody will ever see it. And here they are, completely done and installed. I'm reasonably happy with the end result. I do like the way that they look, although, well, they were quite a bit more work than I really thought they should have been for just columns. Thanks for watching.